Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. In a revelation that sends shockwaves through Genoa City and permanently alters the balance of power among its most dangerous players, a long-buried secret finally claws its way into the light. Matt Clark, the man many believed was operating from the shadows for the sake of control and vengeance, did not merely threaten Sienna's life. He coldly, deliberately ordered Annie to eliminate her, a command whispered in secrecy but loaded with lethal intent, proving once and for all that Matt's obsession with dominance had crossed an irreversible line. For weeks, viewers sensed something dark simmering beneath the surface of Matt's calculated calm, especially in his increasingly volatile interactions with Annie, whose loyalty had always been forged through fear rather than trust, and Sienna, whose quiet intelligence and moral hesitation made her a liability in Matt's ruthless world. What no one anticipated was just how far back the plan went, how meticulously it had been crafted, and how close Sienna came to becoming collateral damage in Matt's twisted chess game. The truth begins to unravel when Annie, visibly unraveling under the weight of guilt and paranoia, starts making reckless mistakes, missed calls, cryptic warnings, nervous glances over her shoulder, prompting Victor Newman to quietly reopen a trail he once dismissed as a dead end. And as Victor digs deeper, aided by Sharon's uncanny intuition and Nick's relentless pursuit of facts, fragments of a conversation surface, audio distorted but unmistakable, capturing Matt's chilling words. "She knows. Too much. Handle it. Permanently." Those three words, when finally pieced together, change everything, because they confirm what Sienna herself had begun to suspect in her darkest moments. That her life was never merely threatened, it was scheduled for erasure. Flashbacks flood in, recontextualizing past scenes with horrifying clarity. Matt cornering Annie in a dimly lit office, his voice low but absolute. Annie's trembling hesitation as she questions whether Sienna truly needs to die. Matt's icy response that mercy is a weakness he can no longer afford. And Annie's eventual nod, a silent surrender to a command she knew would haunt her forever. Meanwhile, Sienna's instincts had already been screaming that something was wrong, especially after noticing Annie's sudden shifts in behavior. Protective one moment, distant the next, and it's that confusion, that painful betrayal, which cuts the deepest when the truth emerges, because Sienna realizes that the woman she once believed might help her escape Matt's web was instead tasked with tightening the noose around her neck. The fallout is explosive when the secret finally detonates in public, not through Matt's confession, but through Annie's emotional collapse during a confrontation that was never meant to become a confession. Cornered by Victor and Sharon, Annie breaks, sobbing as she admits that Matt didn't just suggest removing Sienna as a problem. He demanded it, laying out contingencies, alibis, and escape routes as if he were planning a business merger instead of a murder. And that revelation sends shockwaves through every corner of Genoa City, because it confirms that Matt's crimes aren't impulsive acts of rage, but calculated decisions rooted in power and fear. Victor's fury is immediate and terrifying, because ordering a hit crosses a line even he rarely acknowledges, and as Victor vows that Matt will pay for turning Genoa City into a battlefield, other players begin to reassess their alliances, realizing that anyone who stands too close to Matt is expendable, disposable, and ultimately doomed. For Sienna, the emotional damage is almost as devastating as the physical danger she narrowly escaped, as she grapples with the reality that her life was nearly ended not because of what she did, but because of what she knew, and that knowledge now becomes both her greatest weapon and her most dangerous curse. Annie, racked with remorse, insists she never followed through, claiming she delayed, sabotaged, and ultimately protected Sienna in subtle ways, but the question lingers. Was Annie's conscience truly awakened, or was she simply afraid of becoming a murderer? That ambiguity fuels fierce debate among Genoa City's residents, with some seeing Annie as a victim of Matt's manipulation, while others condemn her for ever agreeing to such a monstrous order in the first place. Matt, for his part, refuses to show remorse when confronted, instead doubling down with chilling arrogance, insisting that in his world, survival demands sacrifice, and if Sienna had died it would have been necessary, a word that sends shivers through even his most loyal associates, because it proves he would make the same choice again without hesitation. As law enforcement begins circling and evidence mounts, Matt's empire starts to fracture from within, with allies quietly distancing themselves and enemies stepping out of the shadows, sensing blood in the water, while Sienna, empowered by the truth yet haunted by what almost happened, must decide whether to disappear for her own safety or stand her ground and expose Matt completely, even if it means painting a permanent target on her back. The storyline crescendos with one undeniable truth echoing through every tense confrontation and whispered conversation. Matt's order to eliminate Sienna was not just a failed assassination, it was the moment his carefully constructed facade collapsed, revealing a man willing to destroy anyone who threatens his control. And as Genoa City braces for the inevitable reckoning, viewers are left gripping the edge of their seats, knowing that this deadly secret has set off a chain reaction that will claim alliances, shatter loyalties, and possibly cost more lives before justice, revenge, or chaos finally prevails. What makes Matt's deadly order reverberate far beyond the initial shock is not merely the act itself, but the cascading psychological warfare that follows, as every character touched by the secret is forced to confront who they really are when morality collides with survival. In the immediate aftermath of Annie's confession, Genoa City enters a strange, suffocating calm, the kind that precedes a storm so violent it reshapes the landscape forever, and Sienna becomes the unwilling epicenter of that tension, waking every morning with the awareness that her continued breathing is an act of defiance against a man who once decided she should stop existing. She begins replaying every interaction she ever had with Matt, scrutinizing his smiles, his encouragements, his sudden silences, and with each memory comes a fresh wave of horror as she realizes how often death had been standing just behind her, waiting for a single phone call from Annie to step forward. Sleep becomes elusive, haunted by nightmares in which footsteps echo behind her and doors refuse to lock. And yet, paradoxically, fear hardens into resolve, because Sienna understands that if she allows Matt to intimidate her into disappearing, he wins without consequence, and that is something she can no longer accept. Victor, meanwhile, moves with ruthless precision, deploying investigators, leveraging favors, and quietly alerting certain power players that Matt Clark has crossed into territory that even the most seasoned predators should fear. And as whispers spread, Matt's once formidable aura begins to crack, because nothing destabilizes a tyrant faster than the realization that his secrets are no longer contained. Annie's role becomes increasingly complicated, as she is neither fully embraced as a whistleblower nor outright condemned as a conspirator, instead existing in a moral limbo that isolates her from everyone she once relied on. She insists repeatedly that she never intended to carry out the order, that each delay was a deliberate attempt to buy Sienna time, but guilt gnaws at her relentlessly, manifesting in panic attacks and moments of dissociation that leave her questioning whether redemption is even possible for someone who once nodded in agreement when murder was placed on the table. As the investigation deepens, Nick uncovers financial transactions and burner phone records that suggest Matt had contingency plans in place, secondary operatives ready to act if Annie failed, which sends a fresh chill through Sienna and reframes Annie's actions as tragically insufficient rather than quietly heroic, because even if Annie had fully rebelled, Matt's machinery was already in motion. Sharon, acting as both confidant and emotional anchor, helps Sienna confront the trauma of being targeted, guiding her through the psychological aftermath of knowing her life was deemed expendable. And these scenes bring a raw vulnerability to the storyline, reminding viewers that the most brutal violence is sometimes the kind that never physically occurs, because the threat alone rewires a person's sense of safety forever. Matt, sensing the walls closing in, shifts tactics, abandoning overt intimidation in favor of gaslighting and manipulation, publicly portraying himself as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign, even going so far as to suggest that Annie fabricated the entire story to escape her own legal trouble, a move that nearly works until Victor produces partial recordings and corroborating evidence that make it impossible to dismiss the allegations as pure fiction. The tension reaches new heights when Sienna is offered witness protection, a lifeline that promises safety but demands sacrifice, forcing her to choose between preserving her life and maintaining her identity, her relationships, and her future in Genoa City. And the weight of that decision becomes a central emotional thread, as she wrestles with the idea that survival might require erasing herself in ways that feel eerily similar to the fate Matt intended for her all along. Annie's downward spiral continues as she becomes the target of both legal scrutiny and public scorn, culminating in a harrowing confrontation with Sienna in which apologies collide with rage, forgiveness remains elusive, and both women are forced to acknowledge that even unintended harm leaves scars that cannot be undone. Matt's empire begins to crumble not through dramatic arrests or explosive confrontations, but through quiet defections, frozen accounts, and partners who suddenly remember urgent reasons to distance themselves, illustrating the poetic justice of a man undone by the same strategic thinking he once used to dominate others. Victor, ever the tactician, resists the urge to strike too quickly, understanding that Matt's greatest punishment will come from prolonged exposure, from watching his power drain away piece by piece as the truth spreads and his allies vanish. As the narrative unfolds, flashbacks reveal more about Matt's psyche, painting a portrait of a man who equates control with survival, who learned early that vulnerability invites destruction, and who now believes with terrifying sincerity that eliminating threats is not cruelty but necessity, a worldview that makes him all the more dangerous because he does not see himself as a villain. The storyline takes another sharp turn when evidence emerges suggesting that Matt may have ordered similar solutions in the past, cases that were written off as accidents or disappearances, raising the stakes from a single attempted hit to a potential pattern of orchestrated violence that could finally bring the full force of the law crashing down on him. Sienna, galvanized by this revelation, makes the bold decision to stay, publicly aligning herself with Victor and refusing to retreat, a move that inspires both admiration and fear among those who know what Matt is capable of when cornered. Annie, seeking atonement, offers to testify fully, even if it means prison, believing that accountability is the only path left to her, and her willingness to face consequences stands in stark contrast to Matt's unyielding defiance, further isolating him morally and emotionally. As court proceedings loom, the tension escalates into a psychological chess match, with Matt attempting to intimidate witnesses through proxies and subtle threats, only to find that the fear he once wielded so effortlessly no longer commands obedience. The climax builds not around a single explosive act, but around the slow, relentless unveiling of truth, as each piece of evidence strips away another layer of Matt's power, until he is exposed not as an untouchable mastermind, but as a man desperately clinging to control in a world that has finally seen him clearly. For Sienna, the journey transforms her from a potential victim into a symbol of resistance, her survival becoming a testament to the idea that even the most carefully planned acts of cruelty can be undone by courage, solidarity, and the refusal to remain silent. The storyline closes this chapter with an uneasy sense of resolution, knowing that while Matt's order to eliminate Sienna failed, its consequences will echo for years to come, reshaping relationships, redefining loyalties, and leaving Genoa City forever changed by the knowledge of how close it came to losing one of its own to a secret that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Even as Genoa City attempts to regain a sense of normalcy, the emotional aftershocks of Matt's deadly order continue to ripple outward, touching lives that were never meant to be part of his ruthless calculation, because secrets of this magnitude do not simply fade once exposed. They linger, they infect, and they force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about power, loyalty, and the cost of silence. Sienna, now living with round-the-clock security and an awareness of danger that never truly switches off, begins to experience a profound shift in how she views herself, realizing that surviving an attempted erasure changes a person at their core, stripping away naivety and replacing it with a sharpened instinct for truth. And this transformation becomes evident in her interactions as she grows less willing to placate others or soften her words, choosing instead to speak with a clarity that borders on fearless, even when it puts her at further risk. Victor watches this evolution with a mixture of respect and concern, recognizing in Sienna the kind of steel that only emerges when someone has stared down annihilation and refused to blink, and while he quietly admires her resolve, he also understands that Matt is not the type of enemy who accepts defeat gracefully, making every step forward a calculated gamble. Annie's situation grows increasingly dire as the legal system tightens its grip, and although she has agreed to cooperate fully, the psychological toll of reliving the moment she agreed, however reluctantly, to Matt's command begins to unravel her sense of identity, because she must now reconcile the version of herself who hesitated with the fact that hesitation alone did not absolve her. And in therapy sessions that expose raw vulnerability, Annie admits that the most terrifying realization is not that Matt ordered the hit, but that a part of her believed she had no choice but to listen. This admission reframes her entire arc, transforming her from a mere accomplice into a cautionary tale about how fear and dependency can slowly erode moral boundaries, a theme that resonates deeply with viewers who have watched characters in Genoa City make small compromises that eventually spiral into irreversible damage. Matt, increasingly isolated and stripped of his usual leverage, begins to unravel in subtle but unmistakable ways, lashing out at former allies, obsessively monitoring news coverage, and replaying conversations in which he insists his actions were misunderstood. And this unraveling reveals a man who cannot comprehend a world in which his authority is questioned, much less dismantled. His attempts to regain control become increasingly desperate, culminating in a chilling private monologue where he insists that history will vindicate him, that those who survive will eventually understand that his methods, however brutal, were necessary to maintain order, a delusion that underscores just how detached he has become from any shared moral reality. Meanwhile, Nick and Sharon work tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure Sienna's story remains front and center, aware that public attention is both a shield and a sword, capable of protecting her through visibility while also escalating the stakes, and their alliance deepens into a quiet but powerful force committed to ensuring that Matt cannot rewrite the narrative to paint himself as the wronged party. The courtroom drama that follows is less about dramatic outbursts and more about suffocating tension, as evidence is presented methodically, each document and testimony reinforcing the horrifying simplicity of Matt's order. And when Annie finally takes the stand, her voice shaking but resolute, she delivers a testimony that leaves the room silent, describing not just what Matt said, but how he said it, with certainty, with expectation, and with the absolute confidence that she would obey. That testimony becomes a turning point, not because it surprises anyone anymore, but because it removes all remaining doubt that Matt's intent was lethal and unwavering. Sienna's own testimony is quieter but no less devastating, as she speaks not of violence but of fear, of the subtle changes she noticed, of the way trust dissolved into suspicion, and of the moment she realized her life had been reduced to a problem someone else intended to solve. And her words resonate precisely because they are restrained, because they capture the emotional truth of being targeted without resorting to dramatics. As the legal process grinds forward, Genoa City's social dynamics shift, with long-standing alliances re-evaluated and new fractures forming, because anyone who once benefited from Matt's influence must now decide whether to confront their complicity or pretend ignorance. And that reckoning exposes hypocrisy in unexpected places. Some characters attempt to distance themselves quietly, while others face their past associations head-on, creating a layered tapestry of accountability that elevates the storyline beyond a simple villain versus victim narrative. The climax of this chapter does not come with a verdict or a final act of violence, but with a moment of profound stillness, when Sienna stands alone in a familiar space, reflecting on how close she came to disappearing, and acknowledges that survival carries its own burden, because living on means carrying the knowledge of what was almost taken, and yet in that acknowledgement she also finds a sense of purpose, vowing privately that she will not allow fear to dictate the rest of her life. Matt's future remains uncertain as the walls continue to close in, but one truth is undeniable. His order to eliminate Sienna has irrevocably altered the moral landscape of Genoa City, exposing the fragility of power built on fear and the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced, ensuring that long after the immediate danger has passed, the echoes of this deadly secret will continue to shape destinies, challenge loyalties, and remind everyone that even in the darkest corners of ambition, conscience can still find a way to speak. In the weeks that follow the most harrowing chapters of the ordeal, Genoa City settles into a fragile equilibrium, one that exists not because wounds have healed, but because everyone involved is too aware of how easily they could be torn open again. Sienna begins to reclaim pieces of her former life, though nothing fits quite the way it once did. As familiar streets feel subtly altered and even friendly faces now carry layers of meaning she cannot unsee, reminding her that trust, once fractured by the knowledge of an ordered death, is never fully restored but instead rebuilt in cautious increments. She finds herself more selective with her energy, gravitating toward people who have proven their loyalty through action rather than words, and this discernment becomes one of the quiet strengths she carries forward, transforming trauma into a sharpened sense of self-preservation that does not rely on paranoia but on clarity. Victor, ever watchful, maintains a protective distance, offering support without smothering, recognizing that Sienna's survival story is not meant to be commandeered by anyone else's agenda, even his own, and in doing so, he demonstrates an unexpected respect for autonomy that contrasts sharply with Matt's suffocating need for control. Annie's fate continues to unfold under the weight of accountability, and while legal consequences loom, her internal journey becomes one of relentless self-examination, as she confronts the reality that saying, "I didn't do it," does not erase the moment she agreed to try, and this reckoning forces her to confront long-standing patterns of submission that predated Matt, suggesting that her vulnerability to his command was rooted in wounds she had never fully addressed. Through mandated counseling and isolated moments of reflection, Annie begins to understand that redemption, if it exists at all, is not granted through excuses or even apologies, but through sustained honesty and a willingness to face the consequences of one's choices, no matter how painful. Matt, increasingly sidelined and stripped of the mystique that once insulated him, becomes a study in unraveling power, as his attempts to project confidence ring hollow and his narrative of justified necessity fails to persuade anyone beyond himself, and this erosion of influence proves more punishing than any immediate legal judgment, because it confronts him with the possibility that his worldview, built on the belief that fear equals respect, was fundamentally flawed. As allies fade and silence replaces deference, Matt is forced into a confrontation with himself that he cannot manipulate or intimidate, a reckoning that exposes the emptiness at the core of his pursuit of dominance. The broader community, watching these events unfold, begins to engage in uncomfortable conversations about the culture of intimidation that allowed Matt to operate unchecked for so long, and these discussions ripple through boardrooms, households, and friendships, prompting a collective reassessment of what behaviors were tolerated in the name of ambition or loyalty. Sienna, though reluctant to be cast as a symbol, becomes an inadvertent catalyst for these conversations, her survival embodying the idea that confronting darkness does not require grand gestures, but the courage to speak when silence would be safer. As the chapter closes, the story resists the temptation of neat resolution, instead embracing the messy reality that justice is often incremental and healing nonlinear, leaving viewers with the understanding that while Matt's order to eliminate Sienna failed, its impact will continue to shape choices, test consciences, and redefine power in Genoa City for a long time to come, ensuring that this deadly secret remains not just a shocking plot twist, but a lasting turning point in the moral evolution of the young and the restless.